Well, good morning. We are in the middle of Sifches, subsection 8. The paragraph in Hebrew begins with the Ein Sarach Loimar, and in English it's needless to say, one who falls asleep and naps. So where are we? We are really at the halachic conclusion after this whole discussion, which is, as we explained yesterday, that when it comes to a meal of Hamaitzi, a meal after which one is required to do the full proper blessing, walking out the room does not constitute an interruption, and therefore no new bracha, Hamaitzi, just continue the meal. Considering, as you put it, you didn't close the circle of your bracha. And we learned that even when it comes to snacks, the kinds of things after which you make burn the fashes, where leaving the room does constitute interruption, but if it's only a temporary break, it doesn't constitute an interruption. And therefore, even if you're drinking a glass of water and you walk out the room for a minute or two, coming back, one doesn't have to make a bracha. Right. It's a hefsek arai because it's a temporary break. Okay, so now there's two more outstanding items. The first is, what is the law with regard to someone who falls asleep during a meal? Does that constitute a break? And is it considered a temporary break in which no bracha is required when one wakes up? Or is it considered a complete full break and therefore new bracha when one wakes up? So says the Alter Rebbe, the Ein Sarach Lemar, needless to say, Misha Yoshan Shinas Arai, one who sleeps a temporary sleep, a nap, the Makim Shadasai, in the place where he is eating. Not that he left the room and fell asleep, but he fell asleep at the table. So because it's only a temporary nap, She'ein Choshev Hefsek Besuda, this does not constitute an interruption in one's meal. Everybody will agree that he can continue eating without a new bracha, because it was a temporary little sleep, little nap. Aval Shinas Keva, if someone fell asleep in a permanent sleep, we'll define that in a second. This is considered too much of a break and too much of a discontinuance of the meal, of what diverted attention. And therefore is considered a break. According to everyone. So even if he stayed in the place, so even though he didn't leave the room, nonetheless, because he fell asleep in such a permanent fashion, that considered as an interruption in the meal. And when he wakes up, he has to make a new bracha. So let's look at footnote 47 and 48 to understand. 47, first of all, how exactly do you define the difference between a temporary nap versus a permanent sleep? And then in 48, we'll get to more details in the footnote as to what the person does when he wakes up from his permanent sleep. So let's look at 47. You see footnote 47 there?
Mm-hmm.
This phrase translates the halachic construct shinas keva, the phrase in English, which he says sleeping for an extended period, is a translation of the word shinas keva, which really means a permanent sleep, which is contrasted to a mere nap, a temporary sleep. So how do you define this? So Piskei Chuvos 178.21 brings three opinions to distinguish between these two degrees of sleep. One, laying down one's bed as opposed to dozing off while seated. This includes putting one's head down on his arm. So one way to understand the difference between permanent versus temporary is, did I go to bed or did I fall asleep in my seat? If I went to bed, that's permanent. If I fell asleep in my seat, my hand on my head, or my head on the table, that's still considered temporary. That's distinction one. B, a deep sleep as opposed to a light sleep. The latter being defined as one during which, if one were called, he would respond. So distinction two is, I'm actually sitting at the table. But if I fall asleep so deeply that if someone calls my name, I'm not waking up, then that's considered permanent sleep. If, however, I'm like half dozing and someone called my name and I'll be, like, wake up a little bit, to respond, then that would be considered a temporary sleep. C, a third manner way of distinguishing is falling asleep beyond one's control as opposed to going to sleep voluntarily. So if I just fell asleep beyond my control, that's a temporary sleep. If I went to sleep voluntarily, intentionally going to sleep, that's considered permanent.
At the table, you're talking.
So distinction one is, again, get this clear. The Alter Rebbe says the difference between permanent sleep or temporary sleep. Temporary sleep does not constitute an interruption of the meal. Permanent sleep is an interruption of the meal. The question is, what is considered permanent versus temporary? Distinction one is, did I go to bed or fell asleep at the table? Distinction 2 and 3 is, even if I'm at the table, how deep is that sleep?
How does one know how deep they really slept when they woke up, after they woke up?
After you wake up?
Like,
well,
how do I know if I just dozed off or I was really like...
No, you can tell. If you have dozed off and you kind of remember what was going on, you kind of can hear what's happening. Okay. Or did you voluntarily go to sleep, like you just involuntarily fell asleep? Or did you actually put your head down, I want to go to sleep? That would be another way of distinguishing. All to say that if you fell asleep permanently, then when you wake up, you have to restart your meal because that was considered a break. If it's a temporary sleep, then you don't have to restart your meal. You just keep on eating. Without any bracha. But look in footnote 48 to see what you have to do if you've had a permanent sleep. What does it mean to restart your meal? Footnote 48. In such a situation, that is to say the person had a permanent sleep, before resuming one's meal, one must also wash Netilas Yadayim again without reciting a blessing. Because if he fell asleep so deeply, then obviously he was not guarding his hands to keep them from being clean as they should be, and therefore he has to wash his hands again, but without a bracha, because whenever you're in doubt as to whether or not you should wash your hands as you are here, then you do it without a bracha. In addition, he must wash his hands due to the nap alone. Never mind because of the break. Okay. Aval Bad, last paragraph. Kol Shaneir, so long as he's awake. If he sat in a spot and he had a long conversation with someone at the table, and that long conversation meant that for an extended period he wasn't eating. So long as he didn't divert his attention from eating, meaning he wasn't in his mind, he was still continuing to eat. A classic example is by a fabrengen. You're eating, and then especially if you're the one conducting the fabrengen, then it's likely that for a good 25, 30, 40 minutes, you could be not eating anything because you're talking. But you're listening to someone talk. But in that instance, you're still at the context of a fabrengen, and you know that when you're done eating, you're going to say l'chaim and eat something. So in that case, you can continue eating without a bracha, and all agree on this question because certainly your meal is not over, even though you happen to have taken a long break between one bite and the next. And some say, even if during this extended time, your mind went away from the fact that you're going to continue eating, because you sat at the same table and you haven't left, you can still continue eating without a bracha. And this will be explained more in detail in chapter 179, which is the next chapter after the one we're reading right now. Okay, so the last outstanding thing is, what's the halach if someone eats in an open field? He's having a picnic. And what constitutes leaving the location? Right? If a person leaves the location in such a way that we're requiring to make a new bracha, as explained in the last 5 or 6 classes you've been doing on this chapter. So a lot of it has to do with a different room, a different building. Can you see the spot where you ate from the new room to the old room, from the old building to the new building? So the question now is, if you're in an open field, what constitutes a new location? Right? Because if you're in a big hall, no matter how big the hall is, because it's one big room, and even if the hall is an L-shaped, and therefore in the new place you cannot see the old place, it's not considered a new location, even though you walked 100 yards and you can't see the spot where you made the first bracha. It's still considered one location because it's one big room. But what about if you're in an open field? Says the Alter Rebbe Halachatas, one who eats in a place that is not surrounded by any barrier. It's an open field. It's unenclosed. So if he moved so far that he can no longer see the spot he ate in that open field, this constitutes a change in location. Equal to equal to one building, two rooms. There are different halachas. You mentioned it in the first chapter. First halacha here, the difference between going to a different building versus going to the same room. When you're going from one room, versus going to a different room in the same building. If you're going to a different room in the same building, then having in mind to move will exempt you from making a new bracha when you move around. And this is not the case when you go to a different building. And therefore, says the Alter Rebbe here, an open field where you've moved so far away that you can no longer see the spot you ate originally. It's considered a new place, but a new place equal to moving from one room to another in one building. Even if a person eats fruit from a tree on the eastern side of the tree, and now he walks around to the other side of the tree on the western side, and a tree trunk is blocking his view. So because now, as he's on the western side, he cannot see the spot he ate on the eastern side because the tree trunk blocks him. This constitutes a new location. Which means if you're eating an apple on the eastern side of the tree and you're not expecting to eat an apple on the western side of the tree, and then you walk to the western side of the tree and you pick up an apple and you want to eat it, and you cannot see the spot you ate on the other side of the tree, you have to make a new bracha. And therefore he has to go back and make a new bracha. When he eats on the western side, if when he ate on the eastern side, he wasn't expecting to eat on the eastern side. If a person's eating in one room, even though in the middle of the room there's an area that's very elevated, there's a big buffet in the middle, and now he's eating on the other side of that buffet or that big thing in the middle. Or here's an example: or if you're walking, there's an oven in the center of the room, and the ovens those days had chimneys going up to the top. So if you're ate on one side of the oven, and now you're on the other side of the oven. And now from this new spot behind the oven, he cannot see the first spot he ate on the other side of the oven. This is not considered a change in place. Because this is all surrounded by one barrier, one enclosure, is considered one location, and it's not considered changing location because you can't see one to the next. This is an example I gave earlier of a big L-shaped hall. You have to walk 100 yards from location A to location B. You cannot see location B you cannot see location A from location B because it's L-shaped, but because it's one big room, it doesn't constitute moving location, and therefore no new bracha. If a person was in a garden or in an orchard, and his intention is to eat from every single tree as he walks along this orchard. He wants to taste them all. He wants to see what the flavor is on each tree, or the different fruits in the different trees. Because once he makes a bracha on one fruit from one tree, he doesn't have to go and make a bracha on every other tree. Because considering the fact that when he made the first bracha on the first tree, he knew he was going to be eating fruits from the other trees. Shimloi came because if he didn't have a mind, nimlachu, this is considered someone who changed his mind regarding how much he wants to eat, and then he has to make a new bracha again. This is something we mentioned earlier. That if I'm eating something and was not expecting a certain dish to arrive, when that dish arrives, I have to make a new bracha. So if I'm eating an apple from tree 1, and I was not expecting to eat anything from tree B, C, and D, when I decide to eat from B, C, and D, I have to make a new bracha. But if, when I ate apple from tree A, I knew I was going to walk around the whole orchard and eat, so then even if it's at a great distance, and even though I may not be able to see the other trees, because it's in one enclosure, it's one orchard, and I had in mind in the first bracha to be eating from the rest of the orchard, that bracha extends like a big hall. But again, the point here is only if it's an enclosure, because it's one big room. And therefore, even if he had in mind when he ate the first apple, he ate the first fruit from the first tree, to be eating from all the other trees. If this orchard is not in one enclosure, so it's not considered one room, and therefore the only way for it to be considered one room is if I can see from one place to the next. Therefore, if you're in an open orchard, there's no fence around it, and I'm eating an apple from tree A, and I was not expecting to eat from tree B, C, and D, or say I was expecting to eat from B, C, and D, I was. My mind, the fact that I had in mind when I made the bracha on fruit from tree A does not help for tree B, C, and D. It doesn't extend to any of the trees that I do not see from the first place. Maybe B, C, and D I see. But if it's a big orchard and it's an open field, if I had in mind when I ate the first apple that I'm going to be eating later in some other, if I cannot see the original spot that I ate when I'm eating later, I have to make a new bracha. This is very relevant if you take your kids apple picking, or your grandkids apple picking. And sometimes you eat as you're picking. And if you're eating an apple, so you know you're going to be snacking on these apples as you go around picking. But by the time you get to the half an hour later, when you're picking that last apple on the other end of the orchard, if that orchard isn't enclosed, you have to make a new bracha. Because you cannot see the original spot that you make the original bracha on, and it's not enclosed, and therefore it constitutes two different locations. And if you go from one location to another location, having in mind doesn't help. Now you might ask, you said before that if you're going from one room to another in the same house, having in mind does help. So why doesn't this constitute having in mind going from room to room, just like it does when you're eating on the eastern side of the tree and then moving to the western side of the tree? You don't make a new bracha if you're expecting to eat on the other side. So explains Alter Rebbe. This is not the same thing as someone who eats in the same tree on the western side versus the eastern side, even though he can't see one to the other. But if he had in mind to be eating on both sides of the tree, he only makes one bracha. Because this is just like one room to another within the same building. We're having in mind does help to extend one's bracha throughout the building. Says Alter Rebbe, but changing location from one tree to another, that's more like going from one house to another. So in other words, each tree in the orchard is like a different house. And each side of the tree is like a different room. And therefore, if I'm eating under one tree, then my expectation that I'm going to be eating from that tree, from all sides of that tree, exempts me from making a bracha as I move around that tree, even if I can't see the original location. But if I'm going from one tree to the next, it's like going from one building to the next. And the fact that I had in mind in building A to eat in building B does not exempt me from making a bracha in building B. Therefore, if I eat in tree A an apple, and then I go eat an apple from tree B, if I cannot see tree A, I have to make a new bracha at tree B. Considering that this orchard is not surrounded in one enclosure. But so long as I see the original spot I ate, this does not constitute a change in place. Even if I'm going from one tree to the next, even if it's not enclosed. If I can see the original location, it's considered one spot. There are those who are stringent here too, to consider it a new location, considering it's a new tree, even if I could see, and therefore we are lenient and not to make a new bracha again. Because as a rule, when you're not sure whether to make a bracha or not, you don't make a bracha. And therefore, if I'm eating at tree A and I go to tree B, if that place is not enclosed, and I cannot see from tree B to tree A, I have to make a new bracha. Now, if I'm going from one orchard to the next, and each orchard is surrounded by its own enclosure, if they're very close to each other. So I have to make a new bracha in the new orchard. Even if when he made the original bracha, he knew he was going to the other orchard, he still has to make a new bracha. Because this is equal to going from one building to another, in which the fact that I have in mind to go to another house doesn't help. I have to make a new bracha in the new house, and therefore going to a new orchard which has a separate enclosure, I have to make a new bracha. God willing, on Monday we will get back to the Gemara, which will take us to the laws of Kiddush. Have a wonderful day and a good Erev Shabbos.